court. The president, in effect, became the necessary ally and partner of each. He lessened bureaucratic tendencies towards self-aggrandizement. He curbed any attempt to gang up on him. He was, in effect, adapting the old method of divide and conquer to his own purposes. His technique was curiously like that of Joseph Stalin, who used the overlapping delegation of function, a close student of his methods has said, to prevent any single chain of command from making major decisions without confronting other arms of the state's bureaucracy and thus bringing the issues into the open at a high level. Roosevelt, like Stalin, was a political administrator in the sense that his first concern was power, albeit for very different ends. From the Book of Matthew. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and he who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And lastly, from Aesop's Fables. The Plowman's Quarrelsome Sons. A plowman's sons were always quarreling. He scolded them to no avail. His words did nothing to change their ways. So he decided to teach them a practical lesson. He asked them to bring him a load of firewood. As soon as they had done this, he gave a bundle to each and told them to break it all up for him. But in spite of all their efforts, they were unable to do so. The plowman therefore undid the bundles and handed each of his sons a stick at a time. These they broke without any trouble. So, said the father, you too, my children, if you stay bound together, can be invincible to your enemies. But if you are divided, you will be easy to defeat. Chapter 18. Expose and attack your opponent's soft flank. The turning strategy. When you attack people directly, you stiffen their resistance and make your task that much harder. There is a better way. Distract your opponent's attention to the front, then attack them from the side, where they least expect it. By hitting them where they are soft, tender, and unprotected, you create a shock, a moment of weakness for you to exploit. Bait people into going out on a limb, exposing their weakness, then rake them with fire from the side. The only way to get stubborn opponents to move is to approach them indirectly. Turning the flank. In 1793, Louis XIV and his wife Marie Antoinette, the King and Queen of France, were beheaded by order of the new government put in place after the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was the daughter of Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria, and as a result of her death, the Austrians became determined enemies of France. Early in 1796, they prepared to invade the country from northern Italy, which at the time was an Austrian possession. In April of that year, the 26-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte was given command of the French army in Italy and charged with a simple mission: to prevent these Austrian armies from entering France. Under Napoleon, for the first time since the Revolution, not only were the French able to hold a defensive position, but they successfully went on the offensive, pushing the Austrians steadily east. Shocking as it was to lose to the Revolutionary Army, it was downright humiliating to be defeated by an unknown general on his first campaign. For 6 months, the Austrians sent armies to defeat Napoleon, but he forced each one to retreat into the fortress of Mantua, until finally this stronghold was crammed with Austrian soldiers. Leaving a force at Mantua to pin down the Austrians, Napoleon established his base to the north, in the pivotal city of Verona. If the Austrians were to win the war, they would somehow have to push him out of Verona and free up the starving soldiers trapped in Mantua. And they were running out of time. In October 1796, Baron Joseph Dalvinci was given command of some 50,000 Austrian soldiers and the urgent mission of expelling the French from Verona. An experienced commander and clever strategist, Dalvinci studied Napoleon's Italian campaign carefully and came to respect his enemy. To defeat this brilliant young general, the Austrians would have to be more flexible. And Dalvinci thought he had the solution. He would divide his army into two columns, one under himself, the other under the Russian general Paul Davidovich. The columns would separately march south, converging at Verona. At the same time, Dalvinci would launch a campaign of deception to make Napoleon think that Davidovich's army was small. It was in fact 18,000 men strong, merely a holding force to protect the Austrian lines of communication. If Napoleon underestimated Davidovich, the Russian general would face less opposition, and his way to Verona would be smooth. Dalvinci's plan was to trap Napoleon between the jaws of these two armies. The Austrians entered northern Italy in early November. To Dalvinci's delight, Napoleon seemed to have fallen for their trick. He sent a relatively light force against Davidovich, who promptly gave the French in Italy their first real defeat, and began his advance toward Verona. Meanwhile, Dalvinci himself advanced all the way to a point not far from Verona, and was poised to fall on the city from the east. As he pored over his maps, Dalvinci took pleasure in his plan. If Napoleon sent more men to stop Davidovich, he would weaken Verona against Dalvinci. If he tried to block Dalvinci's entrance from the east, he would weaken Verona against Davidovich. If he sought reinforcements from his troops at Mantua, he would free up the 20,000 Austrian soldiers trapped there, and they would gobble him up from the south. Dalvinci also knew that Napoleon's men were exhausted and hungry. Having fought for 6 months without rest, they were at a breaking point. Not even a young genius like Napoleon could escape this trap. A few days later, Dalvinci advanced to the village of Caldiero at Verona's doorstep. There he inflicted another defeat on the French troops sent to stop him. After a string of victories, Napoleon had now lost 2 battles in a row. The pendulum had swung against him. As Dalvinci prepared for his final pounce on Verona, he received confusing news. Against all prediction, Napoleon had in fact divided his army in Verona, but instead of sending parts of it against either Dalvinci or Davidovich, he had marched a sizable force somewhere to the southeast. The next day, this army appeared outside the town of Arcola. If the French crossed the river to Arcola and advanced a few miles north, they would directly cross Dalvinci's line of communications and of retreat, and they would be able to seize his supply depots at Villanova. Having this large French army to his rear was more than alarming. Dalvinci was forced to forget about Verona for the moment and hastily marched east. He had retreated in the nick of time and was able to halt the French before they could cross the river and attack Villanova. For several days, the two armies settled into a fiercely contested battle for the bridge at Arcola. Napoleon himself led several charges and was nearly killed. A portion of the troops blocking Mantua were dispatched north to reinforce the French at Arcola, but Dalvinci's army hunkered down, and the battle turned into a stalemate. On the 3rd day of fighting, Dalvinci's soldiers, their lines thinned by relentless French attacks, were preparing for another battle for the bridge when they suddenly heard trumpets blaring from their southern flank. A French force had somehow crossed the river below the bridge and was marching toward the Austrian flank at Arcola. The sound of trumpets was quickly replaced by shouts and the whizzing of bullets. The sudden appearance of the French on their flank was too much for the wearied Austrians. Not waiting to see the size of the French force, they panicked and fled the scene. The French poured across the river. Dalvinci gathered up his men as best he could and managed to lead them east to safety. But the battle for Verona was lost, and with it, the doom of Mantua was sealed. Somehow, Napoleon had managed to snatch victory from defeat. The Battle of Arcola helped forge the legend of his invincibility. Interpretation. Napoleon was no magician, and his defeat of the Austrians in Italy was deceptively simple. Facing 2 armies converging on him, he calculated that Dalvinci's was the more imminent danger. The fight for Caldiero encouraged the Austrians to think that Verona would be defended through direct frontal confrontation. But Napoleon instead divided his army and sent the larger portion of it to threaten the Austrian supply depot and lines of communication and retreat. Had Del Vinci ignored the threat and advanced on Verona, he would have moved farther away from his critical base of operations and put himself in great jeopardy. Had he stayed put, Napoleon would have squeezed him between two armies. In fact, Napoleon knew Del Vinci would have to retreat. The threat was too real, and once he had done so, he would have relinquished the initiative. At Arcola, sensing that the enemy was tiring, Napoleon sent a small contingent to cross the river to the south and march on the Austrian flank, with instructions to make as much noise as possible: trumpets, shouts, gunfire. The presence of this attacking force, small though it was, would induce panic and collapse. The ruse worked. This maneuver, the manœuvre sur le derrière, Napoleon called it, would become a favorite strategy of his. Its success was based on two truths. First, generals like to place their armies in a strong frontal position, whether to make an attack or to meet one. Napoleon would often play on this tendency to face forward in battle by seeming to engage the enemy frontally. In the fog of battle, it was hard to tell that really only half of his army was deployed here, and meanwhile he would sneak the other half to the side or rear. Second, an army sensing attack from the flank is alarmed and vulnerable and must turn to face the threat. This moment of turning contains great weakness and confusion. Even an army in the stronger position, like Del Vinci's at Verona, will almost always lose cohesion and balance as it turns. Learn from the great master himself. Attacking from the front is rarely wise. The soldiers facing you will be tightly packed in, a concentration of force that will amplify their power to resist you. Go for their flank, their vulnerable side. This principle is applicable to conflicts or encounters of any scale. Individuals often show their flank, signal their vulnerability, by its opposite, the front they show most visibly to the world. This front can be an aggressive personality, a way of dealing with people by pushing them around. Or it can be some obvious defense mechanism, a focus on keeping out intruders to maintain stability in their lives. It can be their most cherished beliefs and ideas. It can be the way they make themselves liked. The more you get people to expose this front, to show more of themselves and the directions they tend to move in, the more their unprotected flanks will come into focus. Unconscious desires, gaping insecurities, precarious alliances, uncontrollable compulsions. Once you move on their flanks, your targets will turn to face you and lose their equilibrium. All enemies are vulnerable from their sides. There is no defense against a well-designed flanking maneuver. By B. H. Littlehart. Opposition to the truth is inevitable, especially if it takes the form of a new idea, but the degree of resistance can be diminished by giving thought not only to the aim, but to the method of approach. Avoid a frontal attack on a long-established position. Instead, seek to turn it by flank movement, so that a more penetrable side is exposed to the thrust of truth. Occupying the flank. As a young man, Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, was once captured by pirates. They asked for a ransom of 20 talents. Laughing, he replied that a man of his nobility was worth 50 talents, and he volunteered to pay that sum. His attendants were sent for the money, and Caesar was left alone with these bloodthirsty pirates. For the weeks he remained among them, he participated in their games and revelry, even playing a little rough with them, joking that he would have them crucified someday. Amused by this spirited yet affectionate young man, the pirates practically adopted him as their own. But once the ransom was paid and Caesar was freed, he proceeded to the nearest port, manned some ships at his own expense, then went after the pirates and surprised them in their lair. At first, they welcomed him back, but Caesar had them arrested, took back the money he had given them, and, as promised, had them crucified. In the years to come, many would learn, whether to their delight or to their horror, that this was how Caesar did battle. Caesar, however, did not always exact retribution. In 62 BC, during a religious ceremony in Caesar's home, a young man named Publius Clodius was caught among the female celebrants, dressed as a woman, and cavorting with Caesar's wife Pompeia. This was considered an outrage, and Caesar immediately divorced Pompeia, saying, "My wife must be above suspicion." Yet when Clodius was arrested and tried for sacrilege, Caesar used his money and influence to get the youth acquitted. He was more than repaid a few years later, when he was preparing to leave Rome for wars in Gaul and needed someone to protect his interests while he was away. He used his clout to get Clodius named to the political office of tribune, and in that position, Clodius doggedly supported Caesar's interests, stirring up so much trouble in the Senate with his obnoxious maneuvers that no one had the time or inclination to intrigue against the absent general. The three most powerful men in Rome at the time were Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. Fearing Pompey, a popular and famously successful general, Crassus tried to form a secret alliance with Caesar, but Caesar balked. Instead, a few years later, he approached the wary Pompey, who was suspicious of and hostile toward Caesar as a possible future rival, and suggested they form their own alliance. In return, he promised to support some of Pompey's political proposals, which had been stalled in the Senate. Surprised, Pompey agreed, and Crassus, not wanting to be left out, agreed to join the group to form the first triumvirate, which was to rule Rome for the next several years. In 53 BC, Crassus was killed in battle in Syria, and a power struggle quickly emerged between Pompey and Caesar. Civil war seemed inevitable, and Pompey had more support in the Senate. In 50 BC, the Senate ordered that both Caesar, who was fighting in Gaul at the time, and Pompey should send one of their legions to Syria to support the Roman army fighting there. But since Pompey had already lent Caesar a legion for the war in Gaul, he proposed to send that one to Syria, so that Caesar would have lost 2 legions instead of 1, weakening him for the impending war. Caesar did not complain. He sent off the 2 legions, one of which, however, as he had expected, did not go to Syria, but was conveniently quartered near Rome, at Pompey's disposal. Before the 2 legions left, Caesar paid each soldier handsomely. He also instructed their officers to spread the rumor in Rome that his troops still in Gaul were exhausted, and that should he dare to send them against Pompey, they would switch sides as soon as they had crossed the Alps. Coming to believe these false reports, and expecting massive defections, Pompey did not trouble to recruit more soldiers for the imminent war, which he would later regret. In January of 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the river between Gaul and Italy, a dramatic, unexpected move that initiated the civil war. Caught by surprise, Pompey fled with his legions to Greece, where he began to prepare a major operation. As Caesar marched south, many of Pompey's supporters, left behind in Rome, were terrified. Caesar had established a reputation in Gaul for brutal treatment of the enemy, leveling whole towns and killing their inhabitants. Yet when Caesar took the key town of Corfinium, capturing important senators and army officers who had fought there alongside troops loyal to Pompey, he did not punish these men. In fact, he returned to them the monies his soldiers had looted in taking the town. This remarkable act of clemency became the model for his treatment of Pompey's supporters. Instead of Caesar's men switching allegiance to Pompey, it was Pompey's who now became the most ardent followers of Caesar. As a result, Caesar's march on Rome was quick and bloodless. Next, although Pompey had established his base in Greece, Caesar decided to first attack his flank, the large army he had quartered in Spain. Over several months of campaigning, he completely outmaneuvered this force, led by Pompey's generals Afranius and Petreius, and finally cornered them. They were surrounded, the situation was hopeless, and Afranius and many of the soldiers, knowing of Caesar's gentle treatment of his enemies, sent word that they were ready to surrender. But Petreius, horrified at this betrayal, ordered that any soldier who supported Caesar be slaughtered. Then, determined to go down fighting, he led his remaining men out of the camp for battle. But Caesar refused to engage. The soldiers were unable to fight. Finally, desperately low in supplies, Pompey's men surrendered. This time they could expect the worst, for Caesar knew about the massacre in the camp. Yet once again he pardoned Petreius and Afranius and simply disbanded their army, giving the soldiers supplies and money for their return to Rome. Hearing of this, the Spanish cities still loyal to Pompey quickly changed sides. In a matter of 3 months, Roman Spain had been conquered through a combination of maneuver and diplomacy, and with barely a drop of blood spilled. In the following months, Pompey's political support in Rome evaporated. All he had left was his army. His defeat by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus in northern Greece a year later merely put the seal on his inevitable destruction. Interpretation. Caesar discovered early on in his political life that there are many ways to conquer. Most people advance more or less directly, attempting to overpower their opponents. But unless they kill the foes they beat this way, they are merely creating long-term enemies who harbor deep resentment and will eventually make trouble. Enough such enemies and life becomes dangerous. Caesar found another way to do battle, taking the fight out of his enemies through strategic and cunning generosity. Disarmed like this, enemy becomes ally, negative becomes positive. Later on, if necessary, when the former foe's guard is down, you can exact retribution, as Caesar did with the pirates. Behave more gently, though, and your enemy may become your best follower. So it was with Publius Clodius, who, after disgracing Caesar's home, became the devoted agent of the general's dirty work. When the Civil War broke out, Caesar understood that it was a political phenomenon as much as a military one. In fact, what mattered most was the support of the Senate and the Romans. His acts of mercy were part of a calculated campaign to disarm his enemies and isolate Pompey. In essence, what Caesar was doing here was occupying his enemy's flank. Instead of attacking them frontally and engaging them directly in battle, he would take their side, support their causes, give them gifts, charm them with words and favors. With Caesar apparently on their side, both politically and psychologically, they had no front to fight against, nothing to oppose. In contact with Caesar, all hostility toward him melted away. This way of waging war allowed him to defeat the militarily superior Pompey. Life is full of hostility, some of it overt, some clever and underhanded. Conflict is inevitable. You will never have total peace. Instead of imagining you can avoid these clashes of will, accept them, and know that the way you deal with them will decide your success in life. What good is it to win little battles